So my name's Giles Barrow. I'm based in the UK, live out in the east of England and run a small farm there. And I'm also an educator with a background in teaching, and I'm a TSTA in the educational field.
Tell me about educational work.
Well, educational work takes place, often people assume that it's essentially around schools and working with children and young people. But the field of education also includes working with adults in formal adult training, continuing professional development, as well as community education as well. So it's to coin that phrase, it's a lifelong process and pops up, if you like, in all sorts of informal and formal situations, both in mainstream schooling as well as specialist schooling, and then into higher education too. So anywhere where teaching and learning is taking place, really.
Okay, so a whole range of different places where.
Yeah, and I think for different reasons as well. So obviously, putting children and young people aside, you've got people that are looking to improve their performance and effectiveness within a particular organisation. But then you've also got other groups of adults, like parents, for example, that are wanting to kind of develop their capacity in raising their children. So I wouldn't want to just to kind of have it associated with, like, the formal educational context that we're perhaps familiar with.
What value do you think TA brings then to this work?
I think it's twofold. I think for a long time what TA brought was a very useful educational psychology. It gave educators some real insight into what goes on in the interplay or the relational space, and I think that TA has for a long time provided a range of tools and an understanding for what goes on. But I think perhaps more recently, and by that I mean over, say, the last 10-15 years, what transactional analysis is also doing is bringing a pedagogic model for basing educational practice on. And I think that's a bit more subtle, and I think that's, as I say, a bit more contemporary, really.
Could you say a bit more about what you mean by that?
So the first one that I mentioned about educational psychology, I think, gives us an idea about what goes on in that teaching and learning process. But this reference to pedagogy gives me, as an educator, a theoretical understanding for why I'm doing what I'm doing, regardless of making use of it to understand what goes on. So I think there's something about TA that is strongly associated with a more progressive, radical educational philosophy that's of value in its own right, if you like. Great. I don't know if that sounds too abstract, or is
No,
is
it's
that clear
interesting.
enough?
Interesting. And which models of TA do you think are particularly useful working in education?
Again, I think over the years, so if I think personally, I think over the years there have been some models that have just been profoundly useful to me as an educator, and I think some of the earlier ideas around the cycle of development and the particularly the work of Jean Ilsley-Clark, taking the original model and developing it on from Levin's, has been extraordinarily important to me, particularly in an earlier part of my TA educational career. Then I would also need to put alongside that Susanna Temple's functional fluency model, born out of the classroom, a general theory of behaviour, which I just found extremely easy to apply with educators. More recently, here's one that I've been using more recently, and it comes from the work of Evelyn Papo in Switzerland, and the permission wheel. And what she did, typical of what some educators do, is they take an early model, a model that may be born out of the clinical field, and translate it into an educational use. And as it gets translated, some things happen to that earlier idea. And she took the idea of Jowie's permission wheel. Jowie was a psychotherapist, and what Evelyn has done is started to bring it into the world of education and emphasising the importance of autonomy. If we have more time, I'll talk more about the actual wheel itself, but essentially it's a way of encouraging people to focus on where do you want to grow next, and in growing next, moving towards greater autonomy. And I've been introducing that with people, I was going to say Actually, no, it's both people working in schools, but also people working in training groups with adults. Found it a brilliant tool. So for the people working in schools, these are people mentoring. Their professional role is mentoring adolescents, and they've been using it very overtly with individual adolescents to help track the progress that those adolescents are making as a result of the mentored experience. And those mentors are finding it very, very easy to apply, but also opening up regions which they hadn't hitherto had a language to discuss with young people. So that's been cracking. But I've also been using it with adults in terms of the training group, using it as almost like an assessment tool, a self-reflection tool at the beginning of the training program, and then using it towards the end, so that individuals are reflecting on what degree of growth are they undergoing in relation to building permission during the training program. So I'm having quite a bit of fun with that over this last year or so.
Lovely.
So I'd say that was a more contemporary one for me.
Excellent. And could you give an example of how you might have applied either Susanna Temple's or the cycles of
cycle
development in your work?
I'm working in a special school at the moment, and this is with very young children. They are in residential care, and so these are quite complex cases, and the cycle of development has proven to be a generally useful way of creating an insight of those. They're all boys, but those young boys. And what's happened more recently is they are using now a further adaptation of that model by a chap called Steve Russell. He's created a very graphic wall, if you like, that helps build a profile, not just a profile of the young person, but also then generate strategies for how to address those particular parts of those stages of development that may be open to development. And been using that within little teams of staff in that school around individual kids, and that's been lovely to see the way in which those staff have really taken that on, because it gives them a richer language than purely a behavioural language to make sense of the young people they're working with. So whilst it's been that the beneficiary has been that individual child, what it's doing is it's raising the language and sensibility of the staff team around talking about children more holistically.
And what do you think that the lasting value of you using TA is to the people that you work with?
I'm really reluctant when I'm working with educators to offer, if you like, top tips, and instead I see my work with educators using TA as providing a language that will sustain them beyond the training course. But it might, for some, bring about an opening or an expansion of the frame of reference, complete with ideas and language, that sustains itself in their work. I think often they're finding words to help explain to themselves what often they're already doing, and that with that language have the chance to make it more enduring than be only understood in, I have an intuitive way of working with kids, I just have got that knack, but to know that knack, that intuition is underpinned by something that is that's got a perspective to it that they can then rely on to sustain them when it doesn't always seem to be working.
Okay, so it's about helping people they create a narrative for themselves about what it is that they're doing, and then that narrative gives some sort of structure.
Yes, I was going to say it's more than just a narrative.
To continue doing it, and maybe to add to it, and to really consider what it is that they're doing.
A robustness to build their own resilience, I'd say.
Lovely.
Yeah, I think that's what it might do.
That's lovely. Thanks for coming to talk to me, Giles.
Cheers.